In the forgotten corners of time, where kindness was rarer than gold, one orphan's simple act of sharing his lunch changed the course of destiny. This is not just a story of hunger and survival, but of fate, fortune, and the mysterious way life rewards those with pure hearts. Step into this boring history, where a humble meal unlocked unimaginable doors of prosperity, proving that even the smallest kindness can echo through centuries. In a village that time had almost forgotten, where the sun painted golden streaks across narrow, dust-laden streets, there lived a boy whose existence was measured by scarcity. He was small in stature, not by nature but by circumstance, and the world had afforded him little in comfort or fortune. His clothes were frayed, patched in countless places by hands that had once belonged to strangers. His shoes, if one could call them shoes, were nothing more than thin scraps of leather tied awkwardly around his feet to shield him from the uneven stones and sharp thorns that littered the village paths. And yet, for all this deprivation, the boy possessed something far rarer than the trinkets or treasures that lined the shelves of the wealthier homes in the village. He possessed a heart that did not measure kindness by what one could gain, but by the simple act of giving itself. Each morning, the boy awoke before the first glimmer of light breached the horizon. His home was a small lean-to at the edge of the village, constructed from weathered timber and the remnants of old crates. Inside, the air was always tinged with the smell of damp earth and faint smoke from the tiny stove where he tried, each day, to prepare a modest meal. There was little to eat, as he had no family to provide for him. And the neighbors, while occasionally generous with scraps, were often preoccupied with their own struggles. Yet on this particular morning, the boy found a small piece of bread, baked hastily by a kindly widow who had long noticed the boy's silent diligence and unwavering humility. To him, this bread was more than sustenance. It was a rare treasure, the taste of which he cherished as he broke it slowly, savouring every crumb. As he wandered the village with the bread wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth, he noticed a figure slumped beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree at the edge of the market square. The figure was small, a boy like himself, though ragged in a different way, dirt smeared across his face, his clothes torn, and his eyes hollow with a hunger that had clearly not been sated for some time. The sight of this other boy stirred something deep within him, a kind of recognition that transcended mere circumstance. He remembered the days when he had sat beneath that same tree, stomach aching with emptiness, and wondered if anyone would ever see him, truly see him, in his need. And now, here was another boy, staring back at the world with the same quiet despair, unaware that someone's eyes were upon him with compassion rather than judgment. Without hesitation, the orphan approached. The bread, so carefully preserved for his own meager meal, was now in his hand. Trembling slightly from the weight of a decision, he did not pause to question. He knelt beside the other boy and offered it with the simplest of words. "Take this. Eat. You need it more than I do." There was no flourish, no expectation of repayment, only the pure act of giving. The boy accepted it with a mixture of surprise and disbelief, eyes wide, as if the world itself had just revealed a secret that he had never imagined could exist. He took the bread in small bites, savouring each one as though it were manna fallen from the sky. And in that moment, a subtle shift occurred, not just in the other boy, but in the very fabric of the village, though no one could yet perceive it. The orphan's act did not pass unnoticed. Some would say that the universe has a way of recording deeds of kindness, cataloguing them in invisible ledgers, and that the balance of life has a strange and almost imperceptible memory. For in the days that followed, a chain of events began that no one could have predicted. The widow who had given him the bread noticed a small gesture of appreciation, a bow of the head and a whispered, "Thank you," and it sparked in her a renewed determination to care for those around her. She began to collect small scraps of food each day, enough to share with other children who wandered the streets, often alone and hungry. The boy who had eaten the bread began to speak to others, telling them, in his quiet way, of the generosity he had received, inspiring a network of empathy and attentiveness among the villagers. In this seemingly small exchange of bread, a ripple had formed, spreading outward in ways too subtle for anyone to measure, yet powerful enough to transform the lives of many. It is remarkable how such acts of simple compassion can carry consequences far beyond the understanding of those who perform them. The orphan, unaware of the significance of what he had done, continued with his days, gathering whatever work he could find, mending what needed mending, and always walking with a careful, quiet dignity. He did not seek fame or acknowledgement. There was no expectation of reward, and yet, the story of his generosity travelled, carried by the whispers of those who had witnessed it, by the gratitude of the boy who had eaten the bread, and by the subtle shifts in the attitudes of the villagers themselves. Life, as it often does, began to favour him in ways that could not have been foreseen in that simple moment beneath the olive tree. The story of a single act of compassion is often told in the form of legend, yet legends are but echoes of truth. They remind us that what may seem insignificant to the world, a piece of bread, a kind word, a gentle gesture, can alter the course of history in ways both profound and enduring. The orphan's decision to share his meagre meal created a chain of human connections, a network of goodwill, and a seed of change that would bloom quietly over the years. It was not the wealth of the bread, nor the strategic brilliance of the act, but the purity of intention and the willingness to act in kindness without expectation that carved the first lines of his fortune. Days passed in the village, each unfolding with a rhythm as predictable and deliberate as the turning of the seasons. The orphan awoke each morning to the same pale light, heard the same creak of the old wooden beams, and walked the same uneven paths. Yet beneath the surface of this quiet repetition, the world was subtly shifting. The boy who had eaten the bread began to linger in the market square, watching the interactions of the villagers with a newfound awareness. He noticed the way the blacksmith tempered iron, not only for the strength of the metal, but with pride in his craft. The way the potter carefully shaped the clay as if it were an extension of his own soul. And the way even the smallest gestures, like the baker's nod to a passerby, carried weight. It was as though the simple act of being fed had opened his eyes to the layers of attention, care, and hidden kindness that existed around him, waiting to be noticed. The orphan, meanwhile, continued his own quiet labour. He wandered from house to house, offering his services wherever he could, sweeping the yards, carrying water from the wells, or helping to repair fences that had fallen to disrepair. The villagers, who had long ignored him as just another silent presence in their midst, began to take notice. Some offered small coins, others a loaf of bread, and still others simply a nod of acknowledgement. Yet the orphan accepted nothing with pride or greed. He moved through the village as a thread in a tapestry, not seeking to stand out, but simply performing the acts that life allowed him to perform quietly and faithfully. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets, the orphan encountered a man of considerable wealth and authority. This man was visiting the village to inspect the conditions of trade routes and local production, and he was known for his discerning eye, capable of seeing not only the obvious, but also the subtle forces at play in a community. He observed the orphan from a distance, noting the boy's tireless energy, his careful attention to detail, and the unusual patience with which he moved through his tasks. The man approached, intrigued by this small figure who seemed to radiate a sense of purpose and composure beyond his years. What he did not yet know, and could not have known in that first glance, was that this boy's heart had already begun a quiet revolution through the village. A revolution founded not on force, nor on wealth, but on the invisible currency of human kindness. The ripple of the orphan's actions continued to spread in ways that were at first imperceptible. Other children, inspired by the boy's willingness to share, began to offer what little they had to those even poorer than themselves. A girl with only a small bundle of figs left from her family's modest harvest would now save one or two to give to a child who came to the village square empty-handed. A baker, whose shop had always been known but little appreciated, found new joy in giving away the smallest pastries to the hungry, finding that the act itself nourished him as much as the food nourished others. In this quiet manner, the orphan's single act of compassion became the seed of a movement that grew slowly but surely, threading through the village like an invisible vine, connecting lives that had previously been isolated, lonely, or desperate. Even the natural world seemed to respond to this subtle shift in the human realm. The olive tree under which the first act of sharing had taken place bore heavier fruit that year, its branches stretching wider as if to embrace the village in gratitude. Birds nested more freely in the eaves of houses, chirping in patterns that seemed almost like celebration. Streams of water that had been sluggish during the dry months ran clearer, and the wind, when it moved through the streets, seemed to carry with it a sense of calm and purpose. These changes were not miracles in the dramatic sense, yet they were the quiet harmonies of a world attuned to human virtue, a reflection of the profound yet understated impact of a single compassionate choice. As the orphan moved through this slowly transforming village, he continued to encounter the boy who had received the bread. They shared small conversations, learning of each other's fears, dreams, and simple pleasures. The orphan discovered that the other boy had been living with relatives who were harsh and inattentive, leaving him to fend for himself for much of the day. Yet the small act of kindness, the sharing of bread, had rekindled a sense of trust in the world, a belief that not all who walked the earth were indifferent. In turn, the boy who had received the bread became more confident, more willing to interact with others, and more attentive to the needs of those around him. In time, he began to assist the orphan in small tasks, carrying water or helping to mend fences, perpetuating the cycle of quiet service that had begun with a single gesture. Stories of the orphan's generosity reached beyond the village, carried by travelers, merchants, and wandering minstrels. They spoke not only of the act itself, but of the way it transformed those who experienced it, creating an invisible thread of connectivity between lives that had once seemed separate and isolated. Other villages, upon hearing these accounts, began to adopt similar practices of kindness and attentiveness, understanding that the wealth of a community was not measured solely in coins or crops, but in the empathy and generosity of its inhabitants. What began as a simple offering of bread to a hungry child had, in this way, begun to influence entire networks of human interaction, echoing far beyond the initial moment of giving. In the earliest hours of the morning, when the village lay shrouded in a veil of mist, and the first whispers of sunlight had not yet touched the cobbled streets, there existed a subtle rhythm in the lives of those who inhabited the small, forgotten enclave. It was a rhythm not dictated by authority, nor by law, but by the invisible forces that govern human interaction, forces of gratitude, fate, and quiet consequence. The villagers moved like shadows through the half-light, unaware of how each small action, each slight word, and each gesture carried with it the potential to shape destinies in ways that would only become visible many years later. Among them was the orphan, whose previous act of sharing a humble meal had begun to ripple across the village in ways neither he nor the observers could fully comprehend. It was in this context that the unseen power of gratitude and fate began its subtle work, shaping lives as surely as rivers carve valleys over centuries. Slowly, silently, with persistence beyond measure, gratitude, in its most genuine form, is never loud, never boastful, and often passes unnoticed. Yet it is one of the most potent forces in human life, capable of altering the very course of events. The boy who had received the bread beneath the olive tree had felt gratitude stir within him that day, a warmth that ignited like a small ember in the cold recesses of his heart. He had been hungry, frightened, and alone, and yet in that moment, someone had chosen him, not for gain, not for reward, not for recognition, but simply because they saw him as deserving of attention. That recognition, that acknowledgement of existence, was the seed from which gratitude began to grow. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible growth, taking root beneath the layers of self-doubt, fear, and hardship, yet its presence would soon become evident in every action he undertook. Fate, in its own mysterious manner, operates much like a river, curving and bending, sometimes hidden from view, yet inexorably moving toward its ultimate course. The seemingly random meeting beneath the olive tree was not random at all, though neither boy could have recognized this at the time. The orphan, guided by compassion, and the boy, guided by necessity, had intersected in a pattern dictated by forces far beyond their understanding. Fate often moves through such moments of intersection, unseen by the participants, yet vital in shaping the long-term outcomes of their lives. It is in these quiet intersections unnoticed by the unobservant eye, that the threads of destiny are woven. As the days stretched into weeks, the boy who had been fed began to act upon his gratitude in subtle, almost instinctual ways. He helped the elder women carry water from the well, though no one had asked him to. He swept the streets with care, ensuring that even the smallest pebbles were removed so that others would not stumble. Each act, though small, was infused with a recognition of the kindness he had received, and with every action, he was unknowingly aligning himself with the currents of fate that would shape his own future. Gratitude, as it turns out, does more than express thanks. It reshapes character, refines priorities, and directs attention to the needs of others. The boy's life began to ripple outward, touching those who had once seemed distant or indifferent, creating patterns of goodwill that echoed long after the original act of kindness. Meanwhile, the orphan himself remained largely unaware of the larger forces at play. His life continued in the same rhythm, each day measured in small, deliberate steps, repairing fences, gathering firewood, assisting in menial labor where needed. Yet the universe seemed to respond to his consistency, to his quiet dedication, and to the generosity he had exhibited without expectation. Fate, which often manifests in subtle coincidences and fortuitous circumstances, began to place him in situations where his abilities and character were noticed. A traveling merchant, observing his tireless efforts, remarked on the boy's diligence and offered him a position as an assistant, providing him with not only sustenance but a means of learning the broader workings of trade, commerce, and human interaction. The merchant, unaware of the boy's prior act of sharing, was nonetheless drawn to him by the aura of reliability and integrity that emanated from someone accustomed to practicing virtue without reward. In these moments, the unseen power of gratitude revealed itself as a multiplier of fortune. The boy who had received the bread now found himself in a position to extend his own kindness, passing along small acts that would generate further consequences in ways no one could anticipate. Gratitude, when genuine, is rarely contained. It spills outward, touching multiple lives in succession. The small boy helped a young girl whose dress had torn, and she in turn assisted an elderly man whose cart had broken down. Each act was a ripple, each gesture a link in an invisible chain connecting lives and shaping destinies. The power of such gratitude is that it is both moral and practical, a force that improves the human condition while simultaneously guiding events toward unforeseen outcomes. Fate's hand was equally subtle. The merchant who had taken the orphan under his wing eventually traveled to a neighboring city, encountering influential figures who were impressed by the boy's diligence, intelligence, and patience. In time, opportunities arose that would have seemed impossible just months prior: access to better education, exposure to knowledge beyond the village, and eventually positions of trust that allowed the orphan to influence decisions and direct resources in meaningful ways. What had begun as a simple act of sharing a meal had set in motion a chain of gratitude and fate that culminated in these life-altering developments. None of it was immediate, none of it guaranteed, yet each step was guided by the unseen interplay of human virtue and cosmic coincidence. The villagers, too, began to perceive subtle changes, though they could not articulate them clearly. Productivity increased, not because of laws or regulations, but because those who had been recipients of kindness were more attentive, more willing to cooperate, and more mindful of the needs of their neighbors. Social cohesion, once fragile, grew stronger, and small networks of trust and mutual assistance began to emerge. Fate, it seemed, often uses gratitude as a conduit, aligning individuals with opportunities and circumstances that might otherwise remain inaccessible. The village, once ordinary and largely unnoticed, became a hub of quiet progress, a testament to the invisible power of human decency and the unseen forces that reward it. Even the natural world appeared to respond to these invisible currents. Gardens flourished under careful attention, wells remained full, and the animals that lived alongside the villagers seemed healthier and more vibrant. Observers, if any had paused to reflect, might have speculated that some unseen balance was at work, a subtle harmonization between human intention and worldly response. In essence, the universe, though indifferent in some respects, mirrors the patterns of virtue and gratitude, amplifying small acts into outcomes of far-reaching consequence. As the orphan and the boy he had aided continued their intertwined paths, the lessons of gratitude and fate became increasingly evident. Opportunities arose not merely by chance, but as echoes of prior virtue, recognition and advancement followed in the wake of consistent, deliberate kindness. The boy who had been fed learned that gratitude is not passive. It is an active force, a principle that shapes behavior and generates favorable conditions in ways both practical and moral. Fate, in turn, does not operate randomly. It responds to these patterns, often rewarding patience, humility, and empathy with circumstances that accelerate personal growth and societal benefit. In the heart of the village, where the stone, paved streets twisted unpredictably, and the roofs of homes leaned unevenly toward one another, there existed a quiet rhythm, unnoticed by the majority of its inhabitants. Life was measured in small gestures and modest possessions, in labor repeated each day, and in the subtle interactions that stitched the community together. Yet within this ordinary setting, something remarkable unfolded. For fortune, it seems, has its own logic, one that does not always follow the visible paths of power, wealth, or ambition, but instead gravitates toward those whose hearts are quiet, observant, and humble. The orphan, whose life had been marked by scarcity, simplicity, and patient diligence, exemplified this principle in ways that would come to define both his own destiny and the lives of those around him. Humility is a quality often misunderstood in human society. It is not weakness, nor is it a lack of ambition. Instead, it is a recognition of one's place in the larger order of things, an acknowledgement that life is a vast, interconnected web in which no single person stands entirely alone. The orphan, despite his hardships, possessed this humility in abundance. He did not demand recognition, nor did he seek to accumulate wealth beyond what was necessary for survival. Each day, he moved through the village with careful attention, performing menial tasks with consistency and diligence. Whether mending fences, carrying water, or helping with the harvest, he engaged in each task fully, not for reward or praise, but because it was the right thing to do. This quality, though subtle, set him apart in ways the village could not immediately perceive. Fortune, as it operates, is rarely sudden or dramatic. It is often cumulative, responding to patterns of behavior rather than isolated acts. For the orphan, the long hours of labor, the quiet generosity, and the absence of arrogance became the foundations upon which his future prosperity would be built. Opportunities began to present themselves not because anyone had deliberately chosen to favor him, but because the consistency of his character drew attention naturally. The merchant, who had previously taken notice of his diligence, began to entrust him with increasingly important responsibilities, observing that the boy approached each task with meticulous care and a sense of ethical obligation. In time, this trust grew into mentorship, providing the orphan with insights, knowledge, and connections that would have been inaccessible to someone motivated solely by self-interest. Humility and a generous heart create a resonance that reaches beyond immediate circumstances. The orphan's willingness to share his time, attention, and resources created subtle shifts in the village community. Children emulated his behavior, learning that kindness and patience are forms of wealth that do not deplete through use. Neighbors began to recognize that those who acted with integrity and modesty often inspired others to do the same, creating an ecosystem of mutual support and social stability. The invisible currency of respect, trust, and gratitude began to accumulate around the orphan, gradually translating into tangible opportunities for advancement and recognition. The principle that fortune favors the humble heart is evident not only in human interactions, but also in the subtle ways the environment seems to respond. Gardens tended with care flourish more abundantly, water channels maintained conscientiously resist silting and overflow, and animals nurtured without cruelty thrive and reproduce healthily. These patterns, often unnoticed by the unobservant, mirror the invisible laws of human society. Consistent care, moral attention, and a lack of arrogance create conditions for growth and sustainability. The orphan, through his unassuming presence, became a nexus of such harmonious interactions. He did not seek to control outcomes, rather, he aligned himself with processes that, over time, yielded cumulative advantages. One of the most remarkable aspects of fortune, as it favors humility, is that it often operates through the agency of others. Those who interact with humble individuals tend to trust them more readily, offer assistance without expectation, and create circumstances that enhance their well-being. The orphan, through years of careful observation, subtle effort, and quiet generosity, began to be noticed by figures of influence beyond the village. Traveling merchants, visiting officials, and wandering scholars recognized not only his competence, but the integrity with which he approached his duties. Each interaction, though ordinary in appearance, functioned as a step in an invisible ladder, gradually elevating him from obscurity to positions where he could exert meaningful influence and secure a better life. Yet the rewards of humility are not immediate. They unfold slowly, requiring patience, resilience, and a steadfast commitment to principle. The orphan's life was not suddenly transformed by one event. Instead, fortune accumulated incrementally, like sediment in a riverbed, eventually creating a foundation solid enough to support substantial change. Small acts of diligence, quiet attentiveness, and ethical behavior compounded over time, producing opportunities that were both unexpected and transformative. A neighbor's recommendation led to employment in a more prominent household, which then connected him to merchants traveling to distant towns. Each successive opportunity was a consequence not of aggressive ambition, but of a consistent pattern of behavior rooted in humility and integrity. The village itself became a backdrop for the subtle unfolding of these principles. Social hierarchies, often rigid and unyielding, were softened by the orphan's conduct. He became a mediator in disputes, a helper to the needy, and an exemplar of what could be achieved without arrogance or self-interest. Others observed that his successes were not accompanied by hubris. He remained approachable, patient, and attentive. This reputation, more than any specific act, cemented the perception that his fortune was deserved and that it stemmed from qualities beyond mere chance or favor. Humility, in this sense, acts as both a magnet and a shield attracting beneficial circumstances, while deflecting the corrosive effects of envy and resentment. Even within the intimate, daily rhythms of the village, fortune manifested in subtle yet meaningful ways. Tools were found where they had been lost, neighbors extended unexpected hospitality, and resources appeared at moments of genuine need. While these occurrences could be explained in practical terms, they were also understood by those attuned to human patterns as expressions of the principle that life rewards those who give freely, work diligently, and act with moral attentiveness. The orphan's heart, by remaining humble and generous, aligned with these forces, allowing him to navigate challenges with grace and receive support from sources he could not have anticipated. As time progressed, the orphan's trajectory continued to illustrate the principle in ever-expanding circles. What had begun as small, almost invisible gestures now formed a network of relationships, obligations, and reciprocal respect that extended throughout the village and beyond. The boy who had once received bread under the olive tree became one of his earliest allies, contributing to the cycle of generosity and further reinforcing the notion that fortune is amplified by collaboration and mutual respect. Together, they engaged in activities that strengthened the community, shared resources with those in need, and cultivated trust in ways that were both practical and moral, demonstrating that humble actions can produce consequences far beyond what any single individual could orchestrate.